Sam Rayner and I are very excited, in fact, honored to be here for the Texan Church Conference and love talking about engaged, love talking about better together, love talking about how technology applies. We're going to take you on a circuitous path. I think this is going to get you right back to those issues as we talk about how you can do some things better together in the context of church fostering. Now, when you begin to hear that phrase, you're probably thinking, oh, this is about having foster kids and foster families in your church. And while that is a noble endeavor, and that is kind of the inspiration for it, we're really talking about something different. We're going to talk about how that can then come to your church and really make a difference. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Sam Rayner here in Bradenton, Florida. I'm Thom Rayner, so I'm here. He's there. I'm in Franklin, Tennessee as we're recording this. Sam, let's talk for a moment about church fostering. But before you go to church fostering, tell us about church adoption. And as you go to church adoption, I kind of want to hear your story just a little bit, or your church story. So talk about adoption, fostering, and what I call the South Side story, if you will.
It's a good story, and
it is a good story.
It keeps getting better, which is great. I'm living this right now at my own church. So adoption is the process where a church seeks to get healthier by being adopted externally. And the idea came from what happened in my own family. So you mentioned the foster system. Most people think of fostering children and adopting children. That's where the language came from. There are church mergers that are out there. That's a common term. It's one that I'm fine with. But I just thought, you know what, there's a better way to think about two churches coming together, two families coming together, in a less of a business sense and more of a body sense, a family sense. And so in the case of church adoption, typically it's a less healthy church that is asking to be a part of the family of a healthier church. And so the healthier church adopts the less healthy church, and they are brought into the family of the healthier church. I foster children. We've adopted out of the foster system, so that's where a lot of these ideas came from. And
thank you for my grandson.
Yeah, Dominic. Dominic is we fostered, and then fortunately and unfortunately, there was the case of adoption. Obviously, we were hoping that he would get to go back to his family. That did not happen, so they asked us to adopt him. We were able to adopt him. So adoption is what some may say mergers are. I just like the word,
or acquisitions, or sometimes they even call them replants.
Replant, takeover.
We're coming to take you away.
Hostile takeover, not so hostile. There's different terms for this. And I'm fine with all the terms. Some people have defined these things a little differently. That's fine. I just like the term adoption because I believe it's a biblical term, and I think it's a better way of thinking theologically about what's happening when two churches come together. So a healthier church that brings a less healthy church into their family.
Okay, now let's take it to the next step. Let's talk about church fostering. You just talked about church adoption, and let me mention this. This is really a good segue. Communication is key when these churches start communicating with one another, when they come together. I know that Texan Church is the leadership of the Engage Conference, but when you look at their communication methodologies, their technology, and you're in the process of adopting a church or fostering a church, my goodness, how much would that help just to keep the people in touch with all the things that are going on in the complexity of church adoption, and now what we're talking about, a church fostering opportunity.
Yeah, completely agree. Great organization, good one to be looking at for your communication needs.
Right. Talk to us about church fostering.
Yeah, well, church fostering is what you would expect after hearing about church adoption. Church fostering is where a healthier church works to revive or revitalize a less healthy church for a specific period of time. So fostering has the goal of helping, coming alongside, and serving another church. Some fostering arrangements may result in adoption, as in the case of our Southside story, which we'll tell here in a moment. But better to approach church fostering with just the idea that our church is healthier, so we're going to go serve and help that less healthy church for tends to be 6 months to a year. And there's typically some very specific things that need to be done. Sometimes the church is without a pastor, and you send a preacher to go preach for 6 months. Sometimes a church may need help with outreach, so you develop an outreach plan for them, or children's ministry. There's a specific task for a specific time period where one church serves another church by helping them, sending people and resources to another church. Anything longer than a year, typically, you can develop some dependencies. So you try to keep these within roughly 6 months to 12-year range.
So I was talking to a pastor of a church in South Carolina yesterday. And as I was talking to that pastor, he said some of the things you're saying right here. So talk to me about Southside.
Yeah, Southside's a great story. So it's a church that's Southside Baptist was a church about 2 to 3 miles from our church, West Bradenton. And they'd gone through some very difficult times, and they reached out to us and just asked for help. And typically when churches ask for help, it's something like, help, we may die, we don't know what to do. It's at that point where when you're on the front end of a slow decline, you're typically not reaching out for help. A lot of these cases are desperation cases, which, by the way, if you're listening to this and your church needs help, better to ask early rather than later, because it's easier to fix things before they get too bad than it is when they're far gone. That being said, Southside had gotten to a just very difficult spot. I won't get to all the details of how you can imagine all the reasons for decline and how a church would go from 150 down to 10 or 12, which was what had happened to them. And the people there, and there's particularly one matriarch, and I'll give her a lot of credit. When she called and asked for help, she goes, "We're not going to die. Like, we're just not going to die." And I was just like, okay. She goes, "And you're going to help us." Okay. And they were, here's the thing. I give them all the credit because they were willing to be flexible. They were willing to do what they needed to do. They didn't have a pastor. It was a very tragic situation as to how they no longer had a pastor. And they were hurting and they were confused, and they just didn't know how to reach the neighborhood. So our church sent them a preacher for a year. We sent them resources for a worship team. We helped them begin the process of starting a children's ministry. And by the way, those are great areas to focus on: outreach and preaching, children's ministry, and worship. If you're talking about a fostering arrangement, get those big rocks. But we also helped with the campus and updating the facilities. And a year into the process, it was really time to start winding down our relationship and them getting another pastor. But they just said, "You know what? We would like to become part of your family. We'd like to become part of West Bradenton." And so they then approached us, and it was not an opportune time for my church either. So let me just point this out. We were fostering and then adopting at a time when my church was going through a lot of changes and in a very difficult spot, but God was in it. And so this church long story short, this church of 10 or 12 that was struggling to survive is now 60 to 70, 2 services, 2 languages. We have an English-speaking pastor there and a Spanish-speaking pastor. About half the congregation is English-speaking, about half the congregation is Spanish-speaking. And we need more of those stories. To go from 10 to 70, it doesn't make a lot of magazine articles, but we need more of those stories. And I'm very excited about what has happened. And the church continues to do well. And so it is a campus of West Bradenton now. And yes, it's West Bradenton Southside Campus, and neither campus is in the West or the South.
But those are the names, and they're identified by West B. So let's look at this for a moment. I was talking about the South Carolina pastor. They have an inquiry about a church that needs help. They don't want to, they're not talking about coming in and being a part of their family at this point anyway. They just say, we need some help. Can your church help us? And there were two areas that they said they needed help: worship, which is common, and the median age of the church is around 75. So obviously they needed youth. And so this church is going to come in and work with them, and they're going to have it as a covenant relationship if it goes through. It hadn't been decided yet. If it goes through for 9 to 12 months. And at that point, they will pull back and hope the church is healthy enough to be on its own. Now, let's talk about this, Sam, from the perspective of the church that's let's just focus on fostering now. We're going to put aside adoption. We could go a lot into adoption. Adoption is when a church becomes a part of your church. Usually it becomes a multi-site, and your church has multiple sites. The church you adopted is one of those sites. Like Southside is a campus now of West Bradenton. And then their original campus is a campus of West Bradenton. I never can remember the street. 43rd?
We're off 43rd. Yes, the 43rd Street
43rd.
campus.
I did remember. So the 43rd Street campus is that campus, and then the Southside Church is the Southside campus.
At
Don't go
17th
west.
and, 17th and 17th. Just get it right. 43rd Street and 17th and 17th. It's not that hard.
That's right. I'll get it right. This church is looking in South Carolina, is looking at helping in those same ways. And they are looking at fostering, helping another church. It may result in an adoption, but it doesn't necessarily begin that way or end that way. And so let's put ourselves in the perspective of the church that may help another church. Here's one thing that we know: when a healthier church helps a less healthy church, both get stronger. Let me say that again. When a healthier church helps a less healthy church, both get stronger. The church that is being fostered or being helped gets stronger because resources are provided. The church that is fostering is getting healthier because they are in a Great Commission activity. So many times we don't realize in our churches that when we are helping another church get healthier, it is a direct, obedient activity of the Great Commission.
Yes. And one of the best things that you can do as you help another church, foster another church, is get them thinking outwardly. This is the big reason why churches struggle, they decline, they get into a place where they're not healthy. It's because they lose the perspective of the gospel, the Great Commission, the Axelinate imperative, and moving outward beyond themselves. So the best thing you can do in a fostering arrangement is whatever things you're doing, think outwardly.
Think beyond yourself. This church fostering movement, and when we say fostering, that means that churches helping churches is growing rapidly. We're on the early stages of the church fostering movement, though churches historically have helped other churches. But as far as it's becoming a clearly identified movement, we're in the early stages, but it is beginning to grow, and we do think it will grow rapidly. And another great thing about this is many times when we think about churches in the same community, unfortunately, we think about competition, and competition among churches is deadly and ungodly. But in this case, there is cooperation. There's Great Commission cooperation. There is working together. We are better together instead of apart. And that's why we have mentioned how critical the technology is of communication, such as text in church during this time, because you are doing something that is bringing two separate bodies together, at least for a season. So let's look a little bit more at this, Sam. Why would you say many churches today are becoming a part of the church fostering movement? It's easy for me to understand maybe that church, that desperate church that you just described, that church that it says, if we don't get someone here, we're going to die. Unlike the matriarch who told you we're not going to die, but we still want you to come here. I understand churches in the desperate stage, but why would a West Bradenton, or why would any of our viewers at this conference session, why would they want to become a part of the church fostering movement?
I think we're returning to this idea that we need to be good neighbors. And I think this whole concept of what we see in the Great Commandment is becoming, well, it should have always been popular, but it's becoming more popular, and people are kind of returning to some of the biblical mandates of loving your neighbor as yourself. I know that that's how it started with us at West Bradenton was, well, that's a neighbor, that we're a neighborhood church, that's a neighborhood church, and we're neighbors. And well, why wouldn't we help a neighbor? I think that's part of it. And I also think that there are people talking about it, like us and others. And I think that there is a little more strategy around how you approach helping another church. Whereas in the past, this has always existed and churches have always done this. But it may have just been more needs based. This church over here needs this specific thing, so let's go do this. Now there are actual conversations, there's actual strategies around how you can help another church, and that helps. So when you have a pathway and when you have kind of a roadmap to help you understand how to do this, I think you're more willing to be a part of what I believe is the beginnings of a movement.
And then you have organizations like us, Church Answers at churchanswers.com, where we have now created a resource on churches helping churches. And that was something that you did not see in the past. So it is beginning to, I don't want to use the word institutionalized because that sounds like it's becoming bureaucracy, but it is becoming accepted because many organizations like us, and then Text in Church putting on this Engage conference, we are getting the word out. And so getting the word out is causing more churches to adopt that, or I shouldn't say adopt because we're talking about adoption, to take on these resources or to take on churches in a foster relationship. Okay, I won't call it the elephant in the room because we do talk about it. Usually you don't talk about the elephant in the room, but the big issue is COVID.
Yeah.
We are seeing more churches receptive, yes, to adoption, being adopted and adopting, but also to fostering, because what began in early 2020 and is still going on around the world today, COVID, is on the positive side, giving us a blank slate to look at ministry afresh. So whereas a church may not have considered fostering like West Bradenton did a few years ago, they might today because of this blank slate. What is going on that churches might have a blank slate these days? How is it taking place in churches?
New perspective and more flexibility.
Good.
Your church members, because of the pandemic, have some new perspectives, and it has caused people to think more. Think about the future, think about, are we doing the right things? And you couple that with people who are a little more flexible than they were in the past because of the pandemic, meaning, change just got forced on us. So it kind of forced some flexibility into the church. Churches that would have never thought about going digital did during the pandemic. A lot of churches
art, especially digital giving. That was a biggie during the pandemic.
Yeah, you name it, the churches tried it, right? Drive-in church came back for a season.
And did well.
And let's not forget that was something that was popularized in the 1950s. And who would have thought that would have ever come back? But it did.
And you remember the person who popularized it more than anyone?
Robert Schuller, who would ultimately end up being the founding pastor of the Crystal.
Rejoice, this is the day the Lord has made. We will be glad in it.
Yeah, the Crystal Cathedral, before it was the Crystal Cathedral, was a drive-in church. A lot of people don't know that. There's a lot. People have they have a fresh perspective on things, and they have a little more flexibility. So they're willing to consider new things. I know in my own church, people that would not have been as flexible have really come around and said, okay, we're willing to try something. And I think that's a lot of churches. It's not every church. And it doesn't mean that the blank slate doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you want. We know that. And this season of flexibility is going to end at some point, and people are going to kind of go back to the way that they've done things. But for right now, I do think that people have a fresh perspective and a little more flexibility, and it is it's an opportune time to do something like fostering. It's an important movement, and if you haven't considered it, I think you should be.
During this blank slate time, particularly, I'm thinking about moving to digital giving. I don't know the percentages, but just stabbing in the dark, 50% of the churches had really consistent opportunities for digital giving, and maybe 25% of their members actually took advantage of it. Now that number is probably 75% of churches have digital giving, and maybe 80% are taking advantage of it. That's one of several reasons why in many churches giving has held strong during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. I know in my own church, we were at about 10 to 15% people giving digitally. Now we're closing in on 60, 70% of people giving digitally. And it actually has been of great benefit to our church in terms of consistency. People tend to give more consistently when they give digitally.
And to give them a little bit of context, Sam, your church is what, 70 years old?
Yeah, we were founded. There's a great debate about exactly when we were founded, but somewhere in the late 50s, 57, 58 is the kind of the timeline. I've seen different dates. I've said different dates. Yeah, 1957, 58, somewhere in there.
So not quite 70, but still definitely an established church, definitely a neighborhood church that took advantage of this blank slate time and still is, and move people to digital giving. But it's not limited to that. We're also talking about churches are also learning about this whole idea of church fostering, helping another church, whether you end up adopting that church or not. At this point, the whole movement of church fostering is too early to say it is formulaic. Maybe it should never be. But I think some of our viewers for this part of the conference, Sam, would be interested to know if I want to foster a church. Let's just put it in, I want to help instead of be helped, okay? I want to foster a church. The first question that is always asked is, where do I begin? And after we get them past the beginning point, we will talk about some steps that could be helpful. So I will start. Where you begin in a fostering relationship is usually a relationship. It is not approaching someone and say, we are a healthier church than you are. We're here to help you. It begins with relationships, and that was the case with Southside and West Bradenton.
Yes, don't poach on other churches. A surprise visit saying, you need help, we're here to do it, is unwise and a little too forward. But I would say that calling a pastor, reaching out to local pastors, building those relationships, building those bridges is a really good way to go. Knowing some of the smaller churches in the area, maybe even some of the struggling churches. Not every smaller church is struggling, but a lot of struggling churches are smaller. And just building those relationships. And that's what we did. We had existing relationships with Southside. That's why they reached out to us. They knew that we loved them, and we had already done a few things with them just through some of our people. So we had a relationship connection there, and that's really where it all begins. If you are a pastor, particularly a lead pastor, making sure that you're having those regular lunches, regular contacts, regular coffees with other pastors is how you find out who needs help and who's willing to receive help.
It's where you develop the relationships. And let me add, not only to the coffee and lunch, many of our churches are parts of networks or denominations, and they have churches that meet on a regular basis. There has been a tendency, perhaps in many of the older denominations, for church leaders to say, I don't want to go to that meeting because they don't help me at all. Well, you may want to flip it over. You may want to say, I want to go to that meeting so I can be a blessing if anybody needs me to be so. So you can start getting those type of relationships in those meetings, whether it's a district meeting, associational meeting, whatever the case may be, a citywide ministry meeting. Start developing those relationships. So it begins with relationships, and someone may say, well, that's going to take a long time. Not necessarily. Once you get into a conversation with someone, if they feel like you're genuine in your expression of love, hope, and concern for them, they may turn to you right away and begin the conversation. That's what happened to the church in South Carolina. 2 conversations between 2 people has gotten them to the point of where it is. Okay, so we've developed the relationship. The church says, we need some help. Can you help us? what would you recommend they do next, Sam?
Yeah, there's some key steps that you need to do. You absolutely need to perform your due diligence. And I would just say there are some checkpoints of due diligence that must be done in every fostering relationship and, quite frankly, every adoption as well. In fact, it's even more important with adoption. So these checkpoints are kind of similar between the two, but the perspectives are different depending on whether you're fostering or adopting. And the first is leadership. You need to diagnose where leadership is. What kind of leadership does the church have? What is the governance of the church? Helping a church with congregational government is very different than helping a church that is elder rule. So you have to diagnose the leadership. Who is the pastor? What is the governance? What kind of relationship will we have with them because of the governance? So that's the checkpoint number one. Checkpoint number two is doctrine. Not every church needs to believe exactly the way you believe in order to help them, but you at least need to have a common understanding of the gospel and the fundamentals of the faith. If you differ on some of the fundamentals, then you're probably going to end up rubbing each other the wrong way because of those doctrinal differences. So some may be a little bigger tent, others may have a little more narrow view of doctrine. You just need to know yourself there, and you need to know who you're willing to partner with. So a doctrine check is necessary as well. You need to look at the financials, so leadership, governance, doctrine, financials. What kind of debt load do they have? Are they cash flowing? Do they have reserves? Now,
and that might be more applicable in the adoption maybe than the fostering part.
Well, yes and no, because one of the things that we found out when we fostered Southside, just because we asked, was, do you have a way to fund some of this work? And they said, oh yeah, we just sold a big piece of property. We got plenty of money in the bank. Well, okay.
Okay, I get it.
Now you can fund yourself. You just need our guidance, and you need some of our people resources. You don't necessarily need us sending you more money because you got six figures in the bank. So a lot of these struggling churches actually can fund it. They just need the guidance. They need the leadership. So yes, in adoption, absolutely, you need to get a hold of financials, but I'd say it's important in fostering as well. You also need to do a facility check. Just what kind of campus are you dealing with?
Because you may actually end up doing some type of repairs, some type of maintenance. Your church may actually be involved in that. I think you did a bit of that with Southside.
We did. We actually tore down the sanctuary.
Oh, that's a good move, Sam.
Yeah, and it put a big hole in the ground, and then it rained a lot, and then we had a swimming pool in the front yard. But that's a whole nother.
We'll go there some other time.
That's beyond.
Yeah, with only 2 minutes left in this conference, I'm going to let you tie it up and not go to the hole in the ground, and then I'll have a concluding word.
Yes, from a facility perspective, is this 10 people meeting in an auditorium of 1,000, or is this a room that seats 50? So the facility check is very important, and it will change the way that you approach the fostering relationship. Now, I'll end with this thought. It was a struggle for our church at first. A lot of people didn't understand. Not everyone got the vision right up front. And some people even questioned motives. And by the way, make sure you have the right motive when you foster. Don't go in there thinking, ooh, we can get this campus if we just kind of work an angle. That's a terrible motive. Go because you genuinely want to help. Wrong motives will crush you. But not everyone will get it up front, and that's okay. I think God will honor a genuine effort to help another church, and you can't go wrong by serving the body of Christ. And that's why fostering is an important movement.
That is a good way to put a bow on it, Sam. And I would mention that many churches also look for some type of informal covenant. It doesn't have to be something that is double signed, or it might just be an email. We understand you'll be doing the following, we'll be doing the following. And you understand, church, that at this date, 9 months from now, 10, 11, 12, the fostering relationship or this helping relationship will end. So you know at what point you need to get your own resources. Well, I want to thank you for being a part of our portion of this conference. We are happy to be engaged. We're happy to be working with Text in Church. And although we didn't cover it in detail, it is obvious in the midst of this, a lot of communication needs to take place. Technology is the key to good communication, at least on the broad level. And there's no one better than Text in Church. And so we're happy to be a part of Text in Church. We're happy to be a part of the Engage Conference. We're happy to present this to you. And it's our prayer that it will make a difference, and maybe you will make a difference with another church as you seek to spread the word of God by fostering churches one at a time.